Two, one. Please start.
Yeah, so on behalf of Dr. Reddy's, I'd like to welcome Dr. Omkar Singh to this scientific initiative by us called Win Overactive Bladder, where we discuss the current trends in management of overactive bladder. And welcome, sir. I'd also like to welcome all the attendees for this event for taking their time out and coming here. And I hope we will have a good discussion regarding the current topic. And also, it is the first event of 2021. So I'd like to thank Dr. Omkar Singh for being part of the first activity. So thank you and welcome. And now it's up to you.
Good evening, everyone. Myself, Dr. Omkar. First of all, I want to thank Dr. Reddy's for arranging this beautiful platform on which we can communicate, especially in this COVID time where we cannot meet personally and we cannot have personal gatherings. So I guess in this, when especially this second wave is expected, um, being digital is the way forward now. So today my topic of the talk would be current trends in the management of overactive bladder with a special focus on dawn of the newer drugs like mirabegron. So today's audience would be, I'm expecting urologists, general practitioners, gynecologists who are interested in the management of low urinary tract symptoms. So I would like to start with giving the audience the learning objectives of today's talk. Uh, in this talk, we'll be learning about the understanding of the etiology and the total global word burden, as well as the diagnostic characteristics of the overactive bladder disease. I will also be discussing the pharmacological options which are available for the management of the overactive bladder. We'll be also having an overview of the therapeutic challenges which are associated in the management of this difficult chronic problem, the overactive bladder. And in the end, we'll be able to analyze the efficacy in overcoming the therapeutic challenges which are currently there in the management of overactive bladder. So to start with giving an overview, so what is the definition of overactive bladder? So basically, the overactive bladder has been recognized as a clinical syndrome of symptoms which are which include basically the frequency, urgency, as well as nocturia. When the patient has frequent voiding, which are associated with the severe urgency as well as nocturia, it is basically divided into two types. One is overactive bladder wet, and the other is overactive bladder dry. Dry is when these symptoms, frequency, urgency, and nocturia are not associated with the urinary incontinence, and wet is when it is associated with the bothersome or the otherwise urinary incontinence. So basically, overactive bladder is not a single disease. It is a constellation of symptoms. It is a clinical syndrome. So coming to the burden of the overactive bladder, which was given by a landmark EPIC study, the overall prevalence of the overactive bladder, actually the overactive bladder, it includes the various different symptoms, various different problems, which include different forms of urgency, which are associated with incontinence, whether it is urgency urinary incontinence or stress urinary incontinence or mixed, and there are other types of urinary incontinence. The overall prevalence, which was estimated by this EPIC study, was around 12%, and this study was conducted in 5 different countries. So it was a very big study, and it was seen that the overall prevalence of the overactive bladder, it was increasing with increasing age, and the overactive bladder, it was per se more prevalent than all other type of urgency incontinence when it was combined. So coming to the age and sex specific prevalence of overactive bladder symptoms with or without urgency incontinence, it was the data was provided by a study which was actually a program called Nobel program, which was started in USA. It was published in 2003 in World Journal of Urology. it told us that the overall prevalence of overactive bladder was around 15 to 60%, 16%, and it did not differ by the gender. However, the specific overactive bladder symptoms were more common in women than in men, and all the symptoms were increasing with the increasing age. And moreover, with the age above 60 years, the symptoms were more predominant in men. Coming to another landmark study, which was called EpiLut study, it also gave us the total burden of the overactive bladder. So the prevalence of the overall overactive bladder symptoms with which they classified as at least sometime to at least often symptoms, and the level of bother associated with these symptoms from men and women. This was provided by the EpiLut study, and it was estimated that around 30 million adults more than the age of 40 years in the United States were suffering from the bothersome overactive bladder symptoms. And sex specific differences were more evident in this study, which was published in 2011 in the Journal of Urology. So these studies, they were conducted in 5 Western countries, US, and the non-Asian countries. And what about the prevalence in the Asian population? So it was seen that basically these Asian populations were studies by Murthy and Lepiton, especially in countries like Taiwan and Korean countries, where it was seen that the prevalence among the Asian men was very high compared to the Western countries. It was in the range of 30%, and it was again increasing with the increasing age. And also among the women, the figures were even higher. The prevalence in the Asian among the Asian women was around 53%. So now we have seen the overall prevalence of the overactive bladder. Coming to the etiology, the main causes or the risk factors of overactive bladder. So as we have already discussed, that overactive bladder is not a single disease per se. It is a constellation. It is a group of symptoms. It's a clinical syndrome. So it has been seen that the majority of these patients who suffer from overactive bladder symptoms, they have one or the other underlying urological problems. For example, in men, it was seen that 95% of the men who have overactive bladder symptoms, they have some or the other urological pathology underlying, and majority of them have either benign prostatic enlargement or prostatic obstruction because of the other causes. Similarly, in women, about 73% were seen to have some underlying comorbid urological conditions, and majority of them were having stress urinary incontinence or the pelvic organ prolapse. If we see overall in both the sexes, these patients tend to have either the sphincteric problems, which are classified in sphincteric incontinence or stress urinary incontinence. Men tend to have benign prostatic hyperplasia most commonly. Women similarly have pelvic organ prolapse syndrome and other causes of bladder outlet obstruction. Even the urinary tract infection leading to the overactive bladder symptoms is another a very common etiology of overactive bladder symptoms. So after the etiology, now we are coming to the impact of the overactive bladder on the quality of life. So this is a very important aspect of understanding of the overactive bladder, because overactive bladder, it affects the quality of life in many of the areas of the life. It is a multi-dimensional effect on the quality of life, which includes not only the physical, also the social, more importantly psychological, and the domestic aspects of the patient's life. And because of the severe bothersome overactive bladder symptoms, the clinical syndrome of OAB, it leads to severe psychological distress among the individuals, which leads to restricted social activity. I mean, if you imagine someone who is voiding every 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and not able to hold, and may or may not be associated with urinary leakage, wetting of the clothes, his or her social activity will be severely restricted. And this in turn leads to the decreased productivity, decreased work hours, and loss of wages, which going further ahead leads to sexual health problems, loss of the income. It leads to the cost on the treatment, frequent hospital visits, and this leads to psychological distress and altered psychological behavior among the individuals suffering from OAB symptoms. So now we have seen the overall prevalence, etiology, and the impact of OAB on one's quality of life. Now moving forward, coming to the diagnosis of OAB and mainly the workup of OAB. So it has been seen that the initial there was actually argument, disagreement among various experts on the definitions and workup of the OAB. But there are certain things on which various experts have agreed on. This is the initial assessment and the diagnosis of OAB, which mainly includes four different aspects. Number one is the assessment of the symptoms, and in order to differentiate the OAB symptoms from the other forms of urinary incontinence. So assessment of symptoms include mainly the evaluation of symptoms, and especially which are pertaining to frequency and urgency. And this is best done by taking detailed history, so that the other components, other causes of other causes leading to this clinical syndrome, such as this only stress incontinence and overflow incontinence, can be ruled out at the initial assessment. So number one is the eliciting the detailed history from the individuals or the patients. Second is getting the detailed physical examination, especially that of the abdomen and the neurological examination. And these examination are more important in females. The examination of the pelvis, and in men, this would include genital examination as well as digital rectal examination. Detailed physical examination and the local examination would help to exclude the common causes which are there, for example, BPH in men and pelvic organ prolapse in women. These are the two most important first steps in the initial assessment of and the diagnosis of OAB: assessing the symptoms and taking full history, and then detailed physical examination. Then the third step is the use of the basic, diagnostic tools which are available in the OPD and used for the assessment of OAB symptoms. These includes basically the self monitoring of urgency, frequency, and nocturia, as well as incontinence, which is done by best by the voiding diaries, which are maintained by the patients themselves, if they are taught very well how to do it. And these are very important routine diagnostic tool, which are very cheap and can be done in the OPD. Then the other basic assessment tool is urine analysis, which helps to rule out the possible urinary tract infection. Then coming to the fourth part of the initial assessment and the diagnosis of OAB is the additional or the specialized tests which need to be performed in some special circumstances. These include cystoscopy and imaging of the urinary tract, which include ultrasound as well as MRI, neurological evaluation with the help of in the there are recommendations which are female pelvic medicine and urogenital reconstruction society. So these all recommendation also, sorry, also fall in the line with the previous slide as I have shown. They have also said that the clinician should engage in the diagnostic process to characterize the OAB, and the minimum requirements for this is to take the full problem. AUA and SUFU guidelines for the recommendation for the diagnosis of the OAB symptoms. We have discussed that the number one recommendation is that the uh, clinician should engage in the diagnostic process in order to characterize the OAB symptoms, and the minimum requirements for this is to take the careful detailed history, physical examination, followed by the basic tests like urine analysis. In a few patients, other tests, for example, urine culture, PVR, uroflowmetry, etc., may be required, and this should also include the bladder voiding diaries. And in a very few patients, the specialized tests like urodynamic studies, cystoscopies, and imaging for the upper urinary tracts like ultrasound and the MRI, as well as the neurological evaluation may be required. Now, coming on to the main half of this presentation, this today's topic is the management of the overactive bladder. And our focus will be on the pharmacotherapy, although we'll be discussing briefly on the overall management of the OAB symptoms. So it has been advised by the various guidelining authorities that the management of the overactive bladder should be the overall management, and the conservative approaches should be the first line. And there are two most important conservative approaches which should be applied to each and every patient of the patient who are suffering from overactive bladder. And number one of them is lifestyle modifications, and the lifestyle modifications mainly include the fluid management and reducing specific types of liquids like reduction in caffeine intake, not taking too much of coffee, avoiding chocolate and the foods which have high caffeine content, changing the dietary habits, avoiding the binge eating and heavy foods, and then the lifestyle modifications also include a reduction in the body weight, and because the being overweight has been considered as an independent risk factor for the development of the overactive bladder symptoms. And then the second part of the which is equally important in the conservative approaches in the management of OAB is the behavioral interventions, which include the self-monitoring, which is best done by the voiding diaries. The patient maintains the bladder diary, which includes the amount of the liquids fluid taken, type of the liquids taken, what time they are taking the fluids, and quantity and the timing of the each void. It also includes the frequency of and the number of incontinences, and also measures the number of pad used. Then the behavioral intervention also include scheduled voiding, which is called as bladder training. And the bladder training, which means that your patient is asked, or they fix a time when to void, when whether they have an urge or not. So this is another important aspect of component of behavioral interventions. And there are other behavioral modifications like delayed voiding, double voiding, and light exercises. So these two components, which are lifestyle modifications and behavioral intervention, they are the integral first line conservative approaches for all the patients who have been diagnosed with the clinical syndrome of OAB. Then the third part includes the pelvic muscle rehabilitation, which is done by pelvic floor relaxations, and there are other strategies which are taught to the patients. And there are techniques which are taught to the patients to control their urge, by keeping themselves busy in the routine work, in their routine daily works. And then there are normal voiding techniques, focusing on only on the voiding and keeping their mind away from the other things. Then there are biofeedbacks and specialized pelvic floor rehabilitations, which include electrical stimulation also. So the main focus of this slide would be that the first two points which I have discussed, these are lifestyle modifications and the behavioral intervention. These are the first line therapies, conservative approaches, which are to be offered to all the patients of OAB uh, symptoms. Now coming to apart from the conservative therapies, now coming to drug management of overactive bladders. And in this slide, I would give you an overview of the classification of drugs. Mainly, there are two types of drugs which are used in the treatment of overactive bladder symptoms. Number one are the anticholinergic drugs, which are classically called as anti-muscarinic agents, and the other are non-anticholinergic agents. The examples of classical and the newer anticholinergic agents include oxybutynin, then the tolterodine, which are the very commonly used anti-muscarinic agents till today also. And then there are newer anti-muscarinic agents which include solifenacin, darifenacin, fisoterdine, and trospium chloride agents. Among the non-anticholinergic agents, there are tricyclic antidepressants. Some hormone replacement therapy has also been tried. Desmopressin, because of its antidiuretic hormone-like action, has also been used, and botulinum toxin has been used for the management of OAB. And there are other newer therapeutic agents which have come up in the management. These are beta-3 adrenergic receptor agonists. The main agent in this class is mirabegron. So now giving you an overview of the timeline for the evolution of the drug management, which has evolved over the last 50 years. Around 50 years ago, the first FDA approved anticholinergic and antispasmodic bladder antispasmodic agent was flavoxate, which is also currently still being used. And then again, around more than 20 years ago, the FDA had approved two most widely used anticholinergic agents, oxybutynin and tolterodine, which are still very commonly used agents. And then there was development of the newer anticholinergic agents, including the darifenacin, solifenacin, and trospium. And then started the initial trials of the newer agents, which are beta-3 receptor agonists, especially the mirabegron, which the initial trial, phase 1 trial, started in 2012, leading further to the FDA approval in India in 2017 for this agent. Now coming to the anticholinergic and non-anticholinergic agents in little more detail. So basically, there are cholinergic receptors, which are basically parasympathetic receptors, which are there in the urinary bladder. Although these muscarinic receptors, they are classified subgroups, subclassified from M1 to M5 receptors. Although the most common type of receptors which are there in the bladder is M2, which comprise around 80% of the muscarinic receptors found in the bladder. The most important type of subtype of muscarinic receptors is M3, which is there for 15 to 20%. But the majority of the smooth muscle contractions of the bladder is controlled by the action of the M3 receptors in the bladder. Although the M3 bladder, which are M3 receptors which are there in the bladder, they are also found in the other organs like smooth muscles of the gastrointestinal tract and salivary glands. They are also found in the smooth muscles of the iris. So this is the main reason as their extensive distribution of these muscarinic receptors in the other organs, other parts of the body, which leads to their broad spectrum of side effects from these medications, which include dry mouth because of the blockade of M3 receptors in the salivary glands, then loss of accommodation because of the involvement of the smooth muscles of the iris, and then these muscarinic receptors are there in the brain, which leads to dizziness and headache and ileus because of the presence in the gastrointestinal tract. Then there are so these were the parasympathetic receptors, and there are adrenergic and the sympathetic receptors found in the urinary bladder. And as we know, the sympathetic receptors, they are alpha 1, alpha 2, and beta, which are sub-classified into beta 1, 2, and 3 receptors. And among these beta 3 receptors are the most important receptors, which leads to on their activation, which leads to inhibition of the contractions of the detrusor muscle of the bladder wall. And these beta 3 adrenergic receptors, which are there specifically, they are they are acted upon by the drugs like mirabegron, and these drugs have therefore shown efficacy in the treatment of the overactive bladder, and thus avoiding the other side effects which are there because of the parasympathetic receptors. So this slide gives an overview of the mechanism of action of anticholinergic, basically the anti-muscarinic agents. There's a little bit we have already discussed. So anticholinergic medications, they block the M2 and M3 receptors, leading to the relaxation of the smooth muscles. So in this slide shows a summary of the commonly used anticholinergic agents, including dariphenacin, flavoxate, as we discussed, the first anticholinergic drug, antimuscarinic drugs used, oxybutynin, extended release and immediate release, then oxybutynin patches, solifenacin, tolterodine. The slide shows the initial dose as well as the maximum dose and any dose adjustment which may be required for renal and hepatic dysfunction. Another slide which shows the adverse effects which are associated with the treatment with anticholinergic antimuscarinic agents, and as we can see, the dry mouth and constipation are the most common side effects which are there with these drugs, and the other common side effects are nausea, diarrhea, confusion, blurred vision, confusion or drowsiness, you can see, and dry eyes at the last. So apart from these classical antimuscarinic and the newer antimuscarinic drugs, there was a dawn of the new era in the management of OAB with the discovery of beta 3 agonistic drugs, which is mirabegron. So to take up on from here, I would like to discuss this case of a patient. This is a 70-year-old lady which has overactive bladder symptoms. She is presented to the clinical with complaints of urgency and leakage for last 3 months. Her initial treatment, she was put on oxybutynin, the classical antimuscarinic agent, but she discontinued this medication because of the poor tolerability. She was having side effects. Moreover, this lady also had decreased level of consciousness and behavioral problems. Then she subsequently experienced a slight improvement with the solifenacin, but she again had bothersome side effects, including dryness in mouth, and she also had constant headache. Now, what would be the appropriate treatment strategy for this patient who has, as you can discern from the history, that she is a poor responder to the muscarinic therapy, and she had a lot of side effects because of anti-muscarinic treatment. So to answer this question, first of all, I would like to discuss a few other things. That what is the problem? What is the burden with the anticholinergic medications that had led to the development of the newer therapies actually. So the problem of the anticholinergic drug burden is that as we have already discussed in the initial slides, that this overactive bladder clinical syndrome is a chronic problem. It is a chronic clinical syndrome with a very low rate of absolute cure. So the therapy for the overactive bladder is going to be a long therapy. And the patient has to be really compliant, and the treatment has to be for the patient has to be really compliant full treatment. So this is the problem with the anticholinergic, anti-muscarinic medications, that the long term of the therapy is required, number one, and then there are well defined, and there are side effect profile which includes behavioral problems, cognitive dysfunction also. So this leads to lower persistent with the therapy, and the patient compliance is poor, especially in the elderly. So these problems have led to the development and led to the development of the race towards the development of the newer drugs which should address these problems with the anticholinergic or antimuscarinic medications. So coming to the beta 3 adrenergic receptor agonists, so how they are different from the classical antimuscarinic medications in reducing the symptoms. They also reduce the symptoms, but how they are different is because beta 3 receptor, they are preferentially expressed in the urinary bladder tissue. They are not expressed in the other tissues like salivary glands or gut like the antimuscarinic receptors, and they are predominantly in the detrusor muscle, and they mediate the beta 3 receptor mediated relaxation of the detrusor muscle during the storage phase, unlike the antimuscarinic receptor which only inhibit the involuntary contractions. Beta 3 agonist receptors agonists are also known to increase the capacity of the bladder by this action. So because of this new mechanism of action, these agents which are beta 3 adrenergic receptor agonists, they provide a hope for the overactive bladder patients in terms because they cause direct relaxation of the detrusor muscles, and they have various mechanism of actions, molecular mechanism of action, including stimulation of cyclic AMP generation, opening of the potassium channels, and they inhibit the spontaneous contractility of the bladder during the filling phase and thus increasing the bladder capacity. They also inhibit the bladder afferent activity back to the spinal cord and brain. So this is a timeline of discovery of and development of mirabegron, which is the pinnacle of beta 3 androgen adrenergic receptor agonist. So the development started in late 80s, and which culminated, which led to the approval for marketing in India in 2017 recently. So coming to the little bit of the pharmacokinetics of the mirabegron. Mirabegron is a wonderful drug which is rapidly absorbed after the oral administration, reaching its maximum plasma concentration in merely 3 hours, and it has a plasma half-life of around 50 hours. It is metabolized by the liver as well as the kidney and excreted in the feces and urine. So coming to the mirabegron's efficacy and tolerability studies. So regarding the tolerability and efficacy studies, there have been multiple good quality studies. At least there have been at least 8 randomized controls trials. Out of them, two were phase 2 A and B trials, and then there were at least 6 phase 3 randomized control trials which were there to assess the efficacy and tolerability of mirabegron. And these trials had various names, like Blossom study was there, and there was Dragon study, which were initial phase 2 A and B trials. Then the phase 3 trials included Scorpio trial, there was Capricorn trial, Aries, and Taurus trial. There were studies from Japan and Asia. So Scorpio trial, this is a Scorpio study design of the Scorpio trial, which was the first phase 3 trial conducted among the Australian and European patients. And in this study, there was initial 2-week placebo run period, after which the patients were randomized to 12-week treatment period, and they were randomized to either placebo, mirabegron 50 milligram or 100 milligram, compared with tolterodine extended released 4 milligram once daily for 12 weeks period. And this is the, as I told you, the first phase 3 randomized control trial, in which the mirabegron was compared to the placebo, as well as to the, in 2 different strengths it was compared to the placebo as well as to the classical antimuscarinic tolterodine. And then the primary efficacy endpoints which were assessed was the change from the baseline to the final visit, that is after the 12 weeks treatment, was the number of incontinence episodes and the number of micturations per day. So at the end of the study, it was seen that there was a statistically significant improvement in the number of leakage episodes per day and number of voidings per day. And these patients who were treated with mirabegron, they had better quality of life outcome when they were compared to placebo and compared to the placebo. And the mirabegron has also been in the same study. It was the patient was also subclassified according to whether they have been previously treated with antimuscarine therapy or not. And it was I mean the treatment previously treatment naive patients, or those patients who were previously treated with any antimuscarine therapy. And mirabegron, it was seen that mirabegron resulted in improvement in the mean number of incontinence episodes per day when compared to the placebo. Again, in patients who had received prior antimuscarine therapy also, the mirabegron, as well as treatment naive patient, mirabegron also showed improvement in the frequency of micturations, I mean the number of micturations per day compared to the placebo. Now coming back to the same case which we discussed at the start of the mirabegron therapy. So that lady was advised to take 25 milligram of mirabegron once daily, and she was advised to maintain bladder diary. And after a follow-up visit at 30 days, the patient revealed improvement in the distressing symptoms of OAB and was quite satisfied with the novel therapy which was advised to her. Now coming to the combination therapy of mirabegron and sulfenazone in the management of overactive bladder symptoms. There have been again various studies, and before I start with these superficial overview of these studies, again there is a case presentation. This is a case of a 50-year-old woman who had her last menses at the age of 49 years. She presented with complaints of difficulty voiding, urgency, frequency, and nocturia. And she had around 10 voids more times during the day and 2 to 3 times in the night. And urgency, frequency, nocturia have been present and slowly increasing with intensity since the past few weeks. Medical history was she was a hypertensive. She attained the menopause at the age of 49 years, and use of hormone therapy for 1 year was there. She also had some behavioral problems which included anxiety, depression, and varicose veins, and gestational diabetes during her last pregnancy. Now, what would be the appropriate pharmacotherapy for this patient? Mind you, this patient is hypertension. She had some behavioral problems also. So now, before we answer this question, So coming to the studies which have seen on the efficacy and safety of the combination therapy of mirabegron with the solifenacin. There have been various studies. Majority of them, for example, this study is called Synergy study, and majority of these studies have compared either mirabegron 25 milligram or mirabegron 50 milligram combined with 5 milligram of solifenacin. So the basic idea behind the combination of mirabegron with solifenacin was reducing the dose of the mirabegron so that its side effects like treatment associated development of hypertension, which is the main side effect, this can be reduced, and also reducing on the dose or doses of the classical newer antimuscarinics like solifenacin to reduce their side effect profile also, the incidence of their side effects also. So so this is one study. I would name only this. I would take the names of the studies only because these are very extensive studies. We need not to go into the details of these studies. I will tell you the crux of these studies at the end. So this is the Synergy study, and there was another study called Symphony study, almost had the similar methodology. There again this combination therapy was compared to the placebo also. Then there was this study called Beside study, and in this again the combination was compared to the monotherapy each to mirabegron and solifenacin alone, and then there was another this again one more study by Costello, which was published in 2015. Majority of these studies have assessed the number of micturations per day and number of incontinence episodes per day as the endpoints, as the primary endpoints. And these studies have compared the monotherapy with solifenacin as well as mirabegron with the combination therapy with 25 milligram mirabegron as well as 50 milligram, and as well as with the placebo. So this is another study called Milai study. So the crux of these studies was that all of these studies have shown that combination therapy with the mirabegron and the antimuscarinic such as solifenacin. Solifenacin is the most commonly used, commonly studied agent when combined with the mirabegron. This combination may provide an attractive therapeutic option for the patients with OAB. And the main advantage of combining these two agents is reducing the side effects, incidence of side effects of both these drugs which have separate mechanisms of actions. So coming back to the same patient was advised to take 25 milligram of mirabegron once daily along with 10 milligram of solifenacin. And at the follow-up visit at 30 days, she was totally found to be relieved of overactive bladder symptom and was quite satisfied with the combination therapy which she was advised. So now the key messages of all these studies is that because of the time tested and the agents, antimuscarinic agents, which have been there for last 30 to 50 years, because of their side effect profile, have geared us to exploit the development of the newer novel agents like beta-3 and adrenergic receptor agonists like mirabegron. And I believe that this agent represents a new therapeutic approach in the overactive bladder. And currently, mirabegron is considered as the first-line treatment for patients who are either poor responder to the antimuscarinic therapy or are unable to tolerate the antimuscarinic therapy because of their side effects. Thank you. With this, I would like to end the presentation, and I'll be happy to answer any questions if any viewers would like to ask. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thanks a lot, sir. And there are a few questions which the attendees have asked. So I would like to tell the support team to just help in solving the questions.
Sir, in a chat box, there is a questions. or you can say there is a
Chat,
question answer box.
chat box,
Uh,
Zoom app only, na?
just a moment, sir.
The question is, are there other lifestyle steps that I can take to help manage the overactive bladder? So as I have already told you that the first line approach to the management of OAB symptoms is the conservative approach. The first of these approaches is the lifestyle modifications. The main crux of the lifestyle modification is to manage one's own fluid management, taking specific type of fluids at a particular time. For example, avoiding heavy intake of liquids when they are going out of the house, when they are going for the work, or when they are going to sleep on the bed in the night. And particularly the individual should avoid the heavy intake of fluids which are heavy in caffeine. Should not take chocolates because they induce diuresis. They should cut down the intake of alcohol if they're not able to avoid them. Avoid smoking, which may cause irritative symptoms in the bladder, which may increase these symptoms. And I would also like to add on the role of a little bit of light exercise, which would be a part of the behavioral management also. And there is one more question which has come from an anonymous attendee. The question is, when I have diabetes, how can I keep a check on my own related issue when I have diabetes? Since I have diabetes, see, diabetes, the management of diabetes is also one of the risk factor for the development of overactive bladder symptoms, especially because it leads to a lot of diuresis, which can increase the symptoms of OAB clinical syndrome. So keeping a check on the your own symptoms, the best way is to maintain a bladder diary, avoiding diary. Bladder diary is will help you in keeping a check on your symptoms, as well as it will tell you how you are improving over the course of the time. I would like to attend to one more question. At what age overactive bladder starts to show its symptom? See, we have discussed the prevalence and the burden of the overactive bladder symptoms. It has been seen that the overactive symptoms, they increase with the age, with the increasing age in both men and women. Majority of the studies have included the individuals. They were nationwide surveys which were done in various countries, European countries, USA, as well as in Asian countries. They have included patients which are equal to or more than the age of 40 years. But there are few studies which I am aware of. They have included, particularly, they have done the studies only on the overactive bladder symptoms in children, in children age group, particularly 5 to 18 year of age. But if you ask me, commonly these symptoms appear or start more after the age of 40 years. There's one more question, which is a good question actually. The question is, up till what age one can go for non-surgical procedure for the treatment? See, there is no age for going for the non-surgical treatment of OAB. In fact, the treatment of the OAB, which is non-surgical, which is the conservative treatment, it is for all patients of OAB. So there is no such question that up to this age you should not go for the surgical treatment, and after that only you can go for the surgical treatment. The conservative treatment is for all patients of OAB in any age. How long does it take to treat this, and will one be required to take medication all lifelong? See, this is another very important question I would like to answer. See, the most important aspect of the treatment, as far as I am concerned, is to discuss with the patient and the individual and let them know that this condition, OAB condition, is going to be a chronic condition, and it has a very low rate of complete cure, doesn't get cured. So the treatment is nearly lifelong, whether it is conservative treatment you have to follow, whether the lifestyle modifications, behavioral therapy, or the pharmacotherapy, they are going to be a long term treatment. That is why there is we discuss with the dawn of the new drugs like mirabegron, because they have lesser side effect, I mean the favorable side effect profiles, because the treatment is going to be long and persistent. So any other questions, team?
So thank you, sir, so much for taking your time today and telling the audience about the overactive bladder and its symptoms and cause. So, sir, once again, on behalf of Dr. Reddy's, we would like to thank you as a whole team for coming and discussing. Thank you.
I would also like to thank Team Ready Labs, and they have this beautiful platform on which the various physicians, experts, they can share their ideas, they can disseminate their knowledge, and this platform has helped the other, the attendees to ask their questions and clear their doubts. Thank you very much for giving this opportunity.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.